Welcome to the updated Dr. Bernstein podcast. Please check the description for the original sources, and all content is general in nature and should not be considered medical advice. Today we're diving into type 1 diabetes and cardiovascular health. So specifically, we're going to look at Dr. Bernstein's approach, and we're going to put it to the test, comparing it with a bunch of recent research we found on PubMed, over 600 studies from the past decade.
Wow, that's a lot of research.
Mm.
It's amazing to see how much the field is evolving. New avenues scientists are exploring, things like the impact of specific medications and lifestyle factors, even things like air pollution and socioeconomic disparities.
Right. To make sense of all this info, we'll start with Dr. Bernstein's key points on minimizing cardiovascular risks for those of us with type 1. Then we'll dive headfirst into those PubMed findings, and we'll point out the most interesting studies, especially any surprising results or findings that challenge how we think about this stuff.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm ready. Let's see how Dr. Bernstein's recommendations hold up against the latest science.
Okay, so Dr. Bernstein, a lot of he's really into tight blood sugar control, like much lower than the standard recommendations. He believes that this strict approach is like the key to not having as many long-term complications, especially when it comes to our hearts.
Yeah, and this emphasis on blood sugar control, it's backed by tons of research. Research showing how bad high blood sugar is for your blood vessels and, your heart.
Yeah. And he's not just talking about avoiding those super high blood sugars. He wants to minimize those, spikes and dips we all get throughout the day, like aiming for a flat, steady glucose graph as much as possible.
And that's what makes it so interesting, because we know these blood sugar swings can lead to something called oxidative stress, which basically means like your cells are being attacked by harmful molecules, And after a while, this oxidative stress can really do a number on your blood vessels, and then it increases the risk of that plaque buildup, and that's how you get heart disease.
Right. And to get that level of blood sugar stability, Dr. Bernstein recommends a very low-carb diet, limited protein, and really carefully calculated insulin doses.
That's right. And whether that really strict approach is really necessary or even possible for everyone is still a big debate. And that's exactly why we're diving into all this PubMed research. Let's see what the newest research says.
Okay. So first up, this study that really caught my eye found that even when people with type 1 diabetes have good blood sugar, their risk of heart problems is still higher than those without diabetes. Sure. Like even with good control. Kind of scary, huh?
It is concerning. It really highlights that while managing your blood sugar is super important, and, that's a big part of Dr. Bernstein's thing, it might not be the whole picture. This study, actually, it was done on rats, and it showed that even when their blood sugar was brought down to normal with insulin, there were still problems with how their hearts were working. Specifically, they found differences in what's called diastolic function. And that's the heart's ability to, relax and fill back up with blood between beats, which is really important for pumping blood effectively.
It's like even when our blood sugar looks good,
Yeah.
our heart still know we have diabetes.
Exactly. And it shows just how complex this condition is and that we need to look beyond just blood sugar when we're thinking about long-term heart health, especially for the long term.
Okay, then I found this other study, and it uses something called the fatty liver index. Have you heard of that?
I have. It's a cool area of research.
So for anyone listening who might not know, they calculate this index using things like your BMI and your triglycerides. And what they found was a higher fatty liver index was linked to way higher risk of death and heart problems in people with type 1 diabetes.
Yeah.
Significantly higher.
Yeah, that's a huge finding. And it actually lines up with a lot of what Dr. Bernstein says. You know how he always stresses staying at a healthy weight and not eating too much fat. He's big on that very low-carb diet, which, of course, helps control how much fat your liver stores.
So we've got research backing that up.
We do. And it really points to the importance of not just focusing on one thing. It's not just about blood sugar. It's about taking care of your whole body, things like liver health and body composition. And even our genes play a role in how likely we are to have heart problems.
And speaking of surprises, one study actually found a link between aircraft noise and heart damage in people with diabetes.
Yeah, I saw that one. They looked at a few different mouse models of diabetes type 1 and a couple of types of type 2. And for all of them, that aircraft noise made things worse. The oxidative stress and inflammation and even endothelial dysfunction, which is damage to the lining of the blood vessels. It was all worse with the noise.
Wow. It makes you think, what about all the other things in our environment that might be affecting our health? Like noise pollution. I mean, we never really think about that.
You're right. Now, this study was on mice, but the researchers think it might be true for humans too, especially those of us living with diabetes who are already at higher risk for these problems.
It's definitely something to think about. Like, we can't all just, move away from airports or noisy areas.
Yeah.
But maybe things like stress reduction or even those noise-canceling headphones could
Right.
help.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's about knowing what these triggers might be and finding ways to minimize, how much they affect us.
Okay, let's talk about a study that really emphasized how we all need different approaches to manage our risk for heart problems with type 1 diabetes. This one showed that even in people with good blood sugar, those who also had really bad lows, those super low blood sugar episodes, were more likely to have plaque buildup in their arteries. And this was especially true if they didn't have the usual warning signs of a low.
Oh, wow. That is concerning. And it really highlights that we all react to things like low blood sugar differently. You really have to work with your doctor, make sure your treatment plan is right for you because there's no one solution that fits everyone.
Right. What works for me might not work for you. And those differences can really affect our health in the long run.
Exactly. And this ties back into what we were talking about earlier about how much Dr. Bernstein emphasizes stable blood sugars. For some people, his way might be good, but for others, it might make them more likely to have those lows. And as this study shows, those lows can come with their own problems.
It's like a balancing act.
Exactly. Finding that balance is going to be different for each person.
We've covered a lot, but there's so much more to talk about.
Yeah, let's keep going. So this next study we found, it really shows how important technology can be for managing type 1. It suggests that using that intermittently scanned CGM, the ECGM, where you swipe the reader, it can actually help people avoid going to the hospital. And not just for the typical diabetes emergencies, but for heart problems too.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's not just about having better blood sugar every day. It can actually prevent serious situations.
That's what the research says. This study didn't really get into exactly why it helped people avoid the hospital, but it definitely looks like that is CGM can be a really important part of managing diabetes. And, this kind of goes back to what Dr. Bernstein says about monitoring your blood sugar carefully. He probably wasn't thinking about these fancy gadgets we have today, but the main idea is the same. You got to know what your blood sugar is doing.
Totally. Okay, this next study, I got to be honest, I'm a little confused. So apparently, there are these things in our blood, like fructosamine, and they're called advanced glycation end products. Sort of saying that 5 times fast. Anyway, they might actually be better than the A1C at predicting kidney problems and heart issues in people with type 1.
It is pretty wild, and it's something Dr. Bernstein's mentioned too. You know how he always says the A1C doesn't tell you everything about your blood sugar control? He says it's just an average, but it doesn't show you those ups and downs you get throughout the day.
So are you saying these other things, the fructosamine and those glycation end products, are they showing more of what's happening over time?
That's what it seems like. They're picking up on those little changes that happen over time, those blood sugar swings that the A1C might miss.
So maybe this will change how we keep track of our risks in the future. Like the future of diabetes is all about knowing exactly what's going on with each person.
I think so. And, while we're talking about the future, there's a lot of excitement around those new therapies for type 1. There was a small study was on a drug called teplizumab. It's supposed to slow down type 1 diabetes in people who are at high risk.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. It's like it stops your immune system from attacking your pancreas, right?
Right. This study was really focused on how teplizumab affects your kidneys, but other studies are looking at the long-term benefits, like whether it can actually prevent heart problems. Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Wow, just imagine being able to stop the disease before it really even starts. Amazing.
We can dream. Okay, but let's get back to different ways of managing type 1. One study looked at that continuous glucose monitoring, the CGM that gives you those real-time readings. And even though it's great for keeping your blood sugar in check, they found it didn't really help with blood pressure in people with type 1.
Well, interesting. So even the best technology can't fix everything, huh? All right.
Nope. When it comes to blood pressure and type 1, it usually takes a lot of different things to keep it under control, like diet and exercise, and sometimes medication too. All those things Dr. Bernstein has been saying are important for years.
Right. It's about everything working together. Technology is just one piece of the puzzle. Okay, this next study, it's about type 1 diabetes and something called cardiac autonomic neuropathy.
Yeah, EASE-CAN. Basically, it's a condition that affects the nerves that control your heart rate and other things your body does automatically. It can be really serious for people with diabetes. And the study found that people who had both type 1 and CAN, their kidneys got worse faster than those who didn't have CAN. Like one problem just leads to another.
So you've got to catch these things early, right? Speaking of which, one study used something called, get this, bioelectrical phase angle.
I've heard of that. It's a measure of how healthy your cells are. You can measure it with like a bioimpedance analysis, kind of like those scales that tell you your body fat.
Exactly. And they found that if you have a lower phase angle, you're more likely to have those risk factors for heart problems.
Hmm.
And this was true even for people without diabetes. It could be like an early warning sign, before you even have any symptoms.
Right. It's like another clue for figuring out your risk. Speaking of risk, there was a study that found that people with type 1 were less likely than those with type 2 to get their LDL cholesterol down to a healthy level. And that was even true for people who were already at high risk for heart disease.
Wow, that's concerning. It makes you think that maybe those of us with type 1 need to be even more proactive. Like we need to be asking our doctors tough questions and making sure we're getting the right treatment.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk meds. One study looked at those SGLT2 inhibitors, those drugs they use to lower blood sugar in type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, I heard they might be good for the heart and kidneys too, even
Oh.
for people with type 1.
Yeah, that's what they're looking into. This study compared the SGLT2 inhibitors to GLP-1 receptor agonists. That's another drug that's supposed to be good for your heart.
So did the SGLT2 inhibitors work better for type 1?
Well, both drugs had pretty similar effects on the kidneys and heart for people with type 2 diabetes. But for the people taking SGLT2 inhibitors, their kidney function was less likely to get worse.
Interesting. So it could be a good option for people with type 1 who are worried about their kidneys.
Maybe, but like always, you should talk to your doctor. All medications can have side effects.
For sure. Another study looked at the whole insulin pump versus injections thing.
The age-old debate. This study, what they found is that both ways of taking insulin worked well for controlling blood sugar, and neither one was bad for the heart. So really, it just comes down to what works best for you, what fits with your life and all that.
That makes sense. It's about finding what works for each person, just like with everything else. So what about exercise? Did the research say anything about that?
There was a really interesting study on aerobic exercise, like running and cycling, and how it affects the heart in people with diabetes. Turns out that moderate intensity continuous exercise, like a brisk walk or a nice bike ride, it was actually better at lowering blood sugar for people with type 1, especially the guys.
So guys, if you have type 1, maybe skip the crazy HIIT workout and go for a jog in the park.
Maybe so. But as always, check with your doctor before starting anything new, especially if you have other health issues going on.
What about for women? Did they find anything about exercise and heart health for us ladies with type 1?
It's funny. They found that women with type 1, their hearts actually reacted the same way to both continuous exercise and interval training. But for some reason, the men, they had higher blood pressure overall during the study.
It's like they always say everybody's different, and we have to pay attention to how our own bodies react, especially with type 1.
You got it. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to exercise, especially with diabetes.
Okay, this next study is so cool because it's all about how genes can play a role in type 1 diabetes and heart disease.
This one gets really deep. They used this method called Mendelian randomization to look at whether having type 1 diabetes actually causes certain heart problems.
Okay, I'm going to be honest. I have no idea what Mendelian randomization is. Can you explain it like I'm 5?
Basically, it uses genetics to figure out if one thing causes another. It's like nature is doing an experiment for us.
Okay, I get it. So what did they find out about type 1 diabetes and heart problems?
They found that if you're genetically prone to type 1 diabetes, you're also more likely to have two specific heart conditions. One is called peripheral atherosclerosis. That's when plaque builds up in the arteries in your arms and legs. And the other is coronary atherosclerosis, which is plaque buildup in the arteries of the heart itself.
So wait, even before someone gets type 1, their genes could be making them more likely to have heart problems later on.
It's possible. And here's the kicker. They found that high blood pressure seems to play a role in that connection too.
So it's like, it's not just the diabetes itself, it's how it interacts with these other risk factors.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to manage all of your risk factors, both the ones you can control, like your lifestyle, and the ones you can't, like your genes.
Absolutely. We've covered a ton of research today, but there's still a few more studies I want to touch on before we wrap things up.
Let's do it. Okay, so this next one, it really got me thinking. It's about how common those heart risk factors are in kids and teenagers with type 1.
It's true, we always talk about adults, but these problems can start so young.
Right. And this study, they used data from this huge international registry, and it turned out that things like obesity, high blood pressure, and bad cholesterol were everywhere, especially with the young girls.
That's really concerning.
Yeah.
We have to start taking care of this early, not wait till later.
I agree. We need to be on top of it from the beginning. Catch it early and keep an eye on it. Speaking of, there was a study about the ketogenic diet and, how it affects the heart in people with type 1. Everybody's talking about keto these days.
That's for sure. Everyone wants to know if it's good or bad for type 1. Like, it's promising for weight loss and blood sugar, but some people are worried about the long-term effects. So, what's the answer? Should we all go keto or what?
Well, this study had some pretty interesting results. It looked like a ketogenic diet did help with some things, like arterial stiffness, which is good for your heart. But, get this, it didn't really change blood pressure.
Huh. So it's not a simple answer then,
Yep.
right? It sounds like we need more research, especially for those of us with type 1.
Exactly. It just goes to show you really have to talk to your doctor. What works for your friend might not work for you, and you have to think about your own situation, what risks you already have and all that.
Okay, so today we talked about a ton of research, like how noise pollution can be bad for us, and those early warning signs in our blood, all the way to those new treatments they're working on, and how we all need a plan that works for us, not just a one-size-fits-all thing. But before we go, I want to circle back to Dr. Bernstein one more time.
It's been interesting to see how his recommendations line up with or sometimes even go against the latest research.
For sure. So for everyone listening, what are the most important things to remember from all of this? What do we want them to take away?
I think the biggest thing is to remember that taking care of your heart with type 1 diabetes is a long game. It's not simple, there's a lot to it, and everyone needs a different game plan. Now, Dr. Bernstein's big on strict blood sugar control, low-carb eating, and checking your blood sugar all the time. And research backs a lot of that up, especially when it comes to those blood sugar spikes. Those are bad news. But, and this is important, his way isn't for everyone.
That's right. And it seems like we're learning more and more about how everything is connected, It's not just about blood sugar. It's your liver, your weight, how your body is built, your genes, how you live your life, all of it. You have to be in charge of your own health, ask questions, and find a good doctor who will work with you to figure out what's best.
I agree completely.
So, everyone listening, keep learning, keep fighting for your health, and find a great healthcare team who has your back.
And remember, knowledge is power.
That's the truth. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into type 1 diabetes and heart health. We hope you learned a lot and feel ready to take charge. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.